Hi, I'm Dr. Marilyn Kindig-Stahl, and I'm here to talk to you about cognitive learning theory. Let's get started. First, when you talk about cognitive learning theory in medicine, because I work with medical students, we have to think about the three things that they have to consider. One would be intrinsic learning, then extrinsic learning, followed by germane learning. The intrinsic part then is what we're actually trying to teach them and get them to know. The extrinsic learning then are the things around that they're maybe interrupting their memory or bothering them as they're trying to learn things. And the third part would be germane. So the overall ability of them to have high intrinsic, low extrinsic, and actually learn what we're trying to teach them. When we're doing these kinds of things in our anatomy lab, then intrinsically they're trying to learn the names and how physiology works, but extrinsically they're concerned that what they may draw in our drawing lab may not be beautiful artwork, and so that tends to bother them. Also, when they're trying to learn what other people are drawing at the same time, that can interrupt their field of thought. And germane, putting that all together when we're showing them what questions might be asked when they go into their anatomy sessions in their clinicals. We have to think about all this then with the long-term memory, the short-term memory, and schema. So when we think about these things, their long-term memory is pretty much limitless. Once they've learned things that we're trying to teach them and they've integrated it, they can learn lots and lots over time. The working memory then, where they're trying to learn things, is about 7 items, plus or minus 2. Trying to integrate it together then into their long-term memory is a great way to draw anatomy and put things together for them. The schema then is when they're trying to organize all these things together and put connections between them so they get into their long-term memory. Several principles we need to think about then: the redundancy principle and the signaling principle. So redundancy principle is using items over and over and over, getting too much into their brain so they just don't even want to remember it anymore. And signaling would be pointing things out. So in anatomy, we might point things out on an x-ray, and in this example, like the appendix. The other things that we might point out is when we draw our anatomy and we're able to point to things like this student is doing, and then I can add extra arrows to really show signaling, hey, this is really important, pay attention. Verbal redundancy then might be saying things over and over and over, where if we put pictures with it, that will help them remember more. What is redundant for one person then may not be for another person. It depends on how much information they've had over time on this subject, maybe before. So in the first and second years of medical school, they learn the anatomy, but sometimes it's hard and they haven't integrated it into their long-term memory. So what we're doing in the third year is just trying to help remember and put those connections together. The next thing would be cognitive theory of multimedia learning. We like to use videos and television and work with the entire memory using, of course, words and pictures together. Multimedia. These things then we found through research come into different areas into your brain. The words come into one area while the pictures come into another. That's the dual theory of multimedia learning. We also have limited processing, just like cognitive load theory, where we have 7 items plus or minus 2 and maybe about 20 minutes that we can remember. So after a short time of educating to actually get the students up, move them around, and help them work together on these projects, to the third principle, which would be taking that information, putting it into our brain, organizing it, and solidifying it then into their long-term memory. The final thing today then is to talk about refutation and principles. So refutation is when you take a principle that a student thinks is true, like the world is flat, show them that the world is round based on scientific experiments, and trying to get them to change their view. In medicine, then, we would say that it doesn't really matter what kind of a tubal ligation someone has. It has nothing to do with anything except pregnancy not occurring. But in medicine, there was a study done in 2011 showing that women who'd had their tubal ligations and had the fimbriated end, the fingers, removed, long term had less ovarian cancer. So we can ask students what they know about having tubal ligations done, and when students say, it's an interruption of the tube, we can ask about taking off the fimbriated end or removing the entire tube. Why we do that, point to this research study that shows an improvement of 30% of long-term ovarian cancers, as they think some of the cancers actually start in the fallopian tube and not the ovary. 3 principles then that were in cognitive learning are also in the theory of multimedia learning, would be redundancy and signaling and spatial contiguity. So if we talk about redundancy first, if we're going to use the words and the symbols and show pictures of the same thing over and over, it's too much for people to integrate and remember. Signaling then would be similar to cognitive learning. However, in multimedia, signaling within a video may help the person remember. This is a snapshot of a video that we did showing signaling, as well as using spatial contiguity. In a video with multimedia learning, these students then are able to remember when we're pointing out things and putting the words directly on the screen for them. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you learned something from this video, and watch for me again, Marilyn Kindig-Stahl.
Use the lowest effective dose for the shortest amount of time just to kind of get you through this period of while you're having these symptoms. But it's very safe. There are some questions that I want to ask you before that we would be able to put you on any hormones. So you still have your uterus?
Yes.
Okay. Have you ever had a blood clot? Okay. dose if that's something you're interested in. We